Most philosophy podcasts talk about change, as though it's just a matter of understanding.
We don't do that.
No, because we've seen what actually happens when someone tries to change. Not the theory of it, the reality.
Welcome to Abi Memorably. I'm Holly.
I'm Drake. And yeah, we're different because we're practitioners. We're part of the most ancient anamnetic order of Trikala, MAAOoT.
Philosophy, yes, but also psychological tools for working with mental patterns and physical practices for the body, mind, body, spirit, all three. Because here's the thing, you can understand something perfectly and still not change. We've all had that experience.
And today we're talking about why the mind fights so viciously against its own transformation, even when it knows, absolutely knows, that the change would be good.
Because if you've ever wondered why you keep falling back into old patterns, despite understanding exactly what you're doing wrong, today's episode is for you.
This might be the most practically important thing we've ever discussed.
I think it might be. Let's start with the word itself, because it's a beautiful word that's been badly treated by history.
Metanoia. It's Greek. Meta meaning beyond or after, and nous meaning mind. So metanoia literally means beyond mind. A change so complete that you go beyond your current way of thinking into something fundamentally different.
Not a tweak, not an adjustment, not, I'll try harder this time. A wholesale transformation of how you perceive reality.
And this is where the trouble starts, because the word got absorbed into Christian theology and translated as repentance, which strips out almost everything interesting about it. Repentance implies you did something wrong and you should feel bad and do better. Metanoia implies something far more radical. Your entire operating system needs to be replaced.
It's the difference between updating your software and installing a completely new one.
Right. And when early Christian writers used metanoia, they meant it in the full Greek sense. Turn around completely. See the world with entirely new eyes. Be reborn. It wasn't about guilt. It was about transformation.
And here's the crucial thing. Genuine metanoia requires a kind of death. The person you were has to die for the person you're becoming to be born. Not physically, obviously, but psychologically. The old patterns, the old identity, the old way of seeing things has to dissolve.
And your mind knows this. At some deep, animal level, your mind understands that genuine transformation means the end of who you currently are. And it treats that prospect exactly the way it would treat any other threat to your survival.
It fights.
With everything it's got. So let's talk about what's actually happening in the brain when this resistance kicks in.
Because it's not weakness, it's not laziness, it's biology.
Your brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. Its primary job isn't thinking, isn't reasoning, isn't philosophy. Its primary job is predicting what's going to happen next and keeping you alive through those predictions.
It builds models of reality based on past experience. If I do this, that happens. If I go there, this is what I'll find. If I say this to my partner, they'll react in this way. These models are incredibly efficient. They let you navigate the world without having to figure everything out from scratch every single moment. You walk into a room and within milliseconds, your brain has already predicted the floor will hold, the light switch will work, and nobody is going to attack you, all without conscious thought.
And here's the catch. These models become your identity. The way you predict the world, the assumptions you carry, the automatic responses you've developed over decades. These aren't just habits. They're you. Or at least they feel like you. The brain doesn't distinguish between my prediction model and myself.
So when genuine transformation comes along, when something threatens to reorganize those prediction models, the brain responds as if it's being attacked. Because from its perspective, it is. Something is trying to dismantle the very structures that keep you alive and functioning.
There's also a metabolic dimension to this that people overlook. Maintaining your existing neural pathways is cheap. Your brain has already built the infrastructure. Running familiar patterns is like driving on a motorway. Smooth, fast, minimal fuel. Building new pathways is metabolically expensive. It's like hacking through dense forest. Every step costs energy.
So your brain has an actual physiological incentive to resist change. It's not just psychological, your neurons are literally conserving resources by defaulting to established patterns. Change costs calories, and a brain that evolved during scarcity doesn't waste calories willingly.
The technical term is homeostasis. Every biological system tends toward equilibrium. Your body temperature stays around 37 degrees. Your blood sugar stays within a range. Your resting heart rate finds its set point. And your psychology does the same thing. It finds a pattern and defends it, even if the pattern is making you miserable.
That's the part that baffles people. Why would my brain defend a pattern that's clearly not working?
Because not working and familiar are two very different things to the nervous system. Familiar is safe. Familiar means I know what to expect. Even if what I expect is suffering, at least I know the shape of it. Genuine change means entering the unknown. And the unknown, biologically, is where predators hide.
There's research on this. The default mode network, which is the brain network most associated with self-referential thinking, with your sense of identity, becomes highly active when people encounter information that challenges their self-concept. It's literally your brain working overtime to maintain its existing story about who you are.
And this isn't something you can override with willpower. You can't just decide to stop resisting. The resistance is happening at a level below conscious choice. Before you've even finished thinking, I should change, the defense mechanisms are already deployed.
Which is why so much self-help fails. Just decide to be different. Right, as if the decision is the hard part. The decision is the easy part. What comes after the decision is where the real work begins.
Now, from a psychological perspective, this has been studied extensively.
Freud noticed it first in clinical practice. He found that his patients would sabotage their own treatment in the most creative ways, missing sessions at crucial moments, changing the subject just as important material surfaced, falling asleep on the couch, attacking the therapist verbally. And he recognized that these weren't random events. They were strategies, unconscious strategies for preventing change.
He called it resistance, and he saw it as the central challenge of therapeutic work. The patient comes to you saying, help me change. And then everything they do, unconsciously, is designed to prevent exactly that.
Jung went deeper. He said the ego, your conscious sense of self, functions as a kind of gatekeeper. Its job is to maintain coherence, to keep the story of who you are consistent and intact. And it will sacrifice almost anything, including your happiness, to do this job.
Because incoherence is terrifying to the psyche. If you suddenly don't know who you are, if your self-concept collapses, that can feel like psychosis, like madness. And the ego, whatever its limitations, is at least keeping you sane. So it fights any transformation that threatens to dissolve it.
Even beneficial transformation.
Especially beneficial transformation. Because beneficial transformation is the kind most likely to actually succeed. The ego doesn't bother resisting changes that are obviously going to fail. It reserves its fiercest opposition for the changes that might actually work.
That's such an important insight. If you're encountering intense resistance, that's often a sign you're close to something real. The resistance is proportional to the threat, and genuine transformation is the biggest threat the ego can face.
Which is why people often feel worse before they feel better when they're doing genuine inner work. The increase in discomfort isn't a sign the work is failing. It's a sign the work is reaching something that matters. If you felt nothing, that would be a sign that nothing was changing.
There's also terror management theory, which proposes that much of human behavior is driven by unconscious awareness of death. We build identities, belief systems, cultural worldviews, all partly as buffers against mortality awareness. Our self-concept is, at some level, a shield against the terror of knowing we're going to die. And when transformation threatens those structures, it doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it triggers existential terror, the deep, wordless kind.
So the person trying to genuinely change isn't just fighting a bad habit. They're fighting a survival system that equates their current identity with being alive. The stakes, as far as the psyche is concerned, are literally life and death. The resistance isn't irrational. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's just that what it was designed to do and what you actually need are two very different things.
And this is where wisdom traditions become incredibly relevant, because every serious tradition has encountered this resistance and developed ways of understanding it.
The shamanic traditions might be the most honest about what's happening. Many shamanic initiation practices involve a ritual experience of being dismembered, torn apart, reduced to bones, and then reassembled into something new. It sounds violent because it is violent, psychologically violent. The old self has to be taken apart before the new one can emerge.
And notice that these traditions don't pretend this is comfortable. They don't say, just meditate and you'll feel lovely. They say, this will feel like dying. Because in a real sense, it is.
In Christianity, the concept of kenosis captures something similar: self-emptying. Paul's letter to the Philippians describes Christ emptying himself, and the mystical tradition took this as a model for spiritual practice. You have to empty yourself of your old self to be filled with something new.
Meister Eckhart pushed this to its extreme. He said you have to become so empty that even your concept of God has to go. Everything familiar, everything comfortable, everything you think you know, all of it has to be released.
And in Sufism, there's fana, annihilation, the stage where the individual self dissolves into the divine. The Sufi poets write about this with a mixture of ecstasy and terror because it is both the most beautiful thing you can experience and the most frightening simultaneously.
In Buddhism, the entire framework of attachment addresses this directly. What we're attached to isn't just pleasant experiences or material things. We're attached to our sense of self, to our identity, to the story we tell about who we are. And the Buddha's teaching is that this attachment is the root of suffering.
Which means liberation requires letting go of the very thing your brain is most determined to protect. No wonder it's hard.
The indigenous vision quest traditions understand this too. You go out alone into the wilderness with nothing, no food, no shelter, no companionship, no distractions, and you wait. You wait for the old self to crack open, for the vision to come, but the waiting is excruciating because everything in you wants to flee back to comfort, back to the known, back to the familiar. The whole point of the deprivation is to exhaust the ego's defenses, to bring the resistance to the surface where it can be seen and eventually moved through.
Every one of these traditions, independently, arrived at the same recognition. Genuine transformation involves a passage through some form of death, and the resistance to that passage is not a bug. It's a feature. It's the system working exactly as designed. The question was never, how do I eliminate resistance? It was always, how do I relate to resistance skillfully enough to pass through it?
So what do you do with this if the resistance is biological, if it's deep, if it's essentially your survival system fighting against your growth? How do you work with it?
First, and this might be the most important thing we say today, you stop treating resistance as failure.
That's huge. Because most people, when they encounter their own resistance, when they find themselves procrastinating or making excuses or losing motivation or suddenly becoming fascinated by rearranging their bookshelf instead of doing the inner work they committed to, they interpret it as a personal failing. I'm weak, I'm lazy, I don't want it enough.
None of that is true. What's true is that your nervous system is doing its job. You're encountering a biological response to perceived threat. And shaming yourself for that response doesn't diminish it. It amplifies it. Because now you've added self-attack to the already overwhelming experience of existential threat. You're fighting your resistance, and then fighting yourself for having resistance. 2 wars instead of 1.
The wisdom traditions are unanimous on this. You work with resistance, not against it. You don't try to smash through it. You don't ignore it. You acknowledge it. You respect its intelligence because it is intelligent. It kept you alive. It kept you functioning. And then you find ways to proceed anyway, gently, at a pace your system can tolerate.
Think about it like working with a frightened animal. You don't charge at a frightened horse and expect it to calm down. You approach slowly. You let it see you. You establish trust before you ask it to do anything unfamiliar. The psyche works the same way. Rush it and it bolts.
This is why transformation takes time. Real time. Not a weekend seminar, not a 30-day challenge, but years. Because the nervous system can only integrate so much change at once. Push too fast, and it slams on the brakes. You get burnout, breakdown, regression to earlier patterns. Sometimes worse than where you started.
The change management literature in organizations confirms this on a collective level. Most corporate transformations fail. Not because the strategy is wrong, because the pace overwhelms the system's capacity to adapt. The resistance wins, And then everyone blames the employees for not embracing change, when the actual failure was pushing too hard, too fast, without respecting the natural rhythm of genuine transformation.
And this is where the body dimension becomes critical. Because resistance doesn't just live in your thoughts, it lives in your musculature, in your breathing patterns, in your posture, in the tension you carry without noticing.
Someone approaching genuine transformation will often experience physical symptoms: fatigue, digestive disruption, muscle tension, insomnia, headaches that appear from nowhere, a strange restlessness in the legs. The body is responding to the perceived threat just as urgently as the mind is. And if you're only working at the level of ideas, if you're only reading philosophy and thinking about change, you're ignoring the dimension where the resistance is most deeply anchored.
Wilhelm Reich called this character armor. The idea that chronic muscular tension patterns are literally frozen emotions, frozen resistance. The body holds what the mind can't process. And until you address the body, the holding pattern remains intact no matter how much insight you've gained.
You can have a brilliant intellectual understanding of your patterns and still carry them in your shoulders, still hold them in your locked jaw, still breathe shallowly because your diaphragm won't release the old fear. The body has its own memory, and it doesn't care about your philosophical conclusions.
Which is precisely why our tradition insists on integrating all three dimensions. The philosophical understanding gives you a map of the territory. The psychological practices give you tools for recognizing and working with mental patterns of resistance. And the physical practices give you ways to address the somatic dimension, the tension that thinking alone can't release.
You need all three. Miss anyone, and the resistance finds a way around your efforts. Understand the philosophy, but skip the body work, and your muscles will hold the old pattern even while your mind has moved on. Do the body work, but skip the psychological dimension, and your cognitive habits will pull you back. It has to be integrated. That's not a marketing claim. It's a practical necessity. We've seen what happens when one dimension is neglected.
And it has to be guided, because one of the cleverest things resistance does is make you believe you can handle it alone. I'll figure this out myself. I don't need help. I've got enough books. That voice, that confident, reasonable sounding voice, that's often the resistance speaking, keeping you isolated from the very support that would make change possible.
In every tradition we've studied, transformation happens in relationship: the guru and the disciple, the elder and the initiate, the analyst and the analysand, the guide and the student. Nobody does this alone. Not because they're weak, because the resistance is too clever to be outmaneuvered by the same mind that created it. You can't see your own blind spots. That's what makes them blind spots.
You need someone outside your system who can see what you can't see, who can recognize resistance when you're mistaking it for wisdom, who can say, gently but clearly, that very reasonable argument you just made for why you should slow down, that's the block talking. And then hold steady when you're in the middle of that dismemberment experience and everything feels like it's falling apart.
At Trikala, this is the guide or preceptor's central function, not to teach information, though that happens too, but to hold space for the process of transformation, to calibrate the pace so it's challenging enough to produce growth without being overwhelming enough to trigger shutdown. That calibration is an art. It's different for every student, every pillar, every phase of the work, and it takes years of relationship to get right. Which is why we don't offer weekend intensives. You can't calibrate what you don't know, and knowing someone's resistance patterns takes time. And this brings us to something we don't usually talk about this directly on the podcast.
No, but in this instance, considering what we are discussing today, I feel it's appropriate.
The metanoia block. This concept we've been exploring today, it's not just something we discuss philosophically in our tradition, it's one of the very first things new students learn to work with. First pillar, early sessions.
And there's a very specific reason for that.
Because everything else depends on it. Every other piece of the work, the philosophical study, the physical practices, the deeper psychological tools that come later, all of it runs into the metanoia block eventually. And if you don't have some capacity to recognize it and work with it, you'll hit a wall and you won't understand why.
Think about it practically. A student begins with the first pillar. They're reading primary texts, they're starting daily practice, they're learning to observe their own patterns, and within weeks, sometimes days, the resistance shows up. Maybe they forget to do their practice 3 days in a row. Maybe they start finding reasons why the texts aren't relevant to their life. Maybe they pick a fight with their preceptor over something trivial.
And if they don't understand what's happening, they'll interpret all of that at face value. I forgot. This isn't working for me. My guide doesn't understand me. And they'll quit. Not because the work failed, because the metanoia block succeeded.
That's why it has to come first. Before you can work with any tradition, before you can engage with any practice deeply enough for it to matter, you need to recognize the mechanism that will try to pull you away from it.
It's like learning to swim. The first thing you learn isn't the butterfly stroke. It's how to be comfortable with water on your face, how to not panic. Because if you panic in the water, no technique in the world will save you. You have to address the panic response before anything else becomes possible.
The metanoia block is the panic response of the psyche encountering genuine change. And teaching students to recognize it, to name it when it's happening, to feel it in their body without being overwhelmed by it. That's the foundation everything else is built on.
And I want to be clear about something. We're not talking about eliminating it. You can't eliminate it. It's a fundamental feature of how the mind works. It's always there. What changes is your relationship to it.
Exactly. An untrained person encounters the metanoia block and is controlled by it. They don't even know it's happening. They just think they've lost motivation, or the program isn't right for them, or they've got too much going on right now to keep up with the work. The block generates perfectly reasonable sounding stories, and the person believes every one of them.
A trained person encounters the same block and recognizes it. Ah, there it is. There's that familiar contraction. There's that sudden conviction that I should stop. They feel all the same resistance, the same discomfort, the same pull toward the familiar, but they're not ambushed by it. They can see it for what it is.
And that's the difference between being in control and being controlled, not the absence of resistance, the presence of awareness.
We spend significant time on this in the early sessions, multiple weeks, with homework, with guided practice, with the guide reflecting back what they observe in the students' patterns. Because this isn't something you grasp intellectually and then possess. It's a skill. Like any skill, it develops through repetition, through failure, through refinement.
A student might recognize their metanoia block clearly in one domain and be completely blind to it in another. They can see it in their reluctance to do the daily practice, but they can't see it in how they intellectualize the teachings to avoid feeling them. The block is clever. It moves, it adapts, it finds new disguises.
Which is why the guide is so essential in this process. The guide has seen these patterns hundreds of times. They know the disguises. They can spot the block operating even when the student is completely convinced they're making a free choice.
And it's not about the guide being smarter than the student, it's about perspective. You can't read the label from inside the jar. Someone outside your system can see what you genuinely cannot.
So please, no matter what you're trying to engage in, if you find that this is happening to you, a student of Trikala or not, try and find someone who can be your guide, your mentor, your preceptor. You'll be 100 times better off for doing it.
We've had some brilliant messages recently. Want to share a few?
Absolutely.
First from Kenji, who is just outside of Osaka in Japan. He's writing about the Butterfly Dream episode, number 175, where we explore Zhuangzi's famous parable. He says, I keep coming back to the question of which is the dream and which is the reality. But practically speaking, does it matter? If both feel equally real while you're experiencing them, does the distinction change how you should live?
Kenji, that's a genuinely philosophical question. And Zhuangzi, I think, would say you've already grasped the point. The parable isn't really asking you to determine which state is more real. It's dissolving the certainty that you already know. It's unsettling your confident assumption that waking life is obviously the true one.
And practically, I think it matters enormously. Because once you lose that automatic certainty, you start paying more attention. If this might be a dream, then every moment becomes more vivid, more precious, more worthy of full engagement. The uncertainty doesn't paralyze you. It wakes you up. Some of the most present, most alive people I've met are people who've genuinely faced the possibility that reality isn't what it seems and chose to engage fully anyway.
It's actually very close to what we were discussing last week about negative capability. The ability to hold that open question without needing to resolve it. Am I the man or the butterfly? Stay with the question. Let it work on you. The question is the practice.
Wonderful question, Kenji.
Next one. Fatima in Casablanca, responding to the Eleusinian Mysteries episode, number 188. She writes, "You described how the greatest minds in the ancient world were initiated into these rites and none of them ever revealed what happened. In our age of leaks and transparency, could anything remain genuinely secret? Is secrecy even possible anymore?"
That's such a good contemporary question.
And I think the answer is yes, but not the way we usually think about secrecy. The Eleusinian initiates didn't keep quiet because they were afraid of punishment, although there was that. They kept quiet because the experience was inherently incommunicable. It was something you had to undergo. Describing it in words would have been like describing the taste of strawberries to someone who'd never eaten one.
The deepest truths in any tradition are like this. They're experiential, not informational. You can leak a document, you can't leak a transformation. Even if an initiate had written down every detail of the ceremony, it wouldn't have transmitted the experience. The secret protects itself because it can only be known through direct encounter.
Which is actually why we operate the way we do. Certain aspects of our work can't be communicated through a podcast. Not because we're being coy, because the practices only make sense inside the relationship, inside the progression, inside the lived experience of working with them over time. Some things genuinely require direct transmission.
Exactly. Our tradition has initiatory ceremonies and rituals that trace their roots back thousands of years. They're still being actively practiced today, all over the world, but no matter how hard you search online, you won't find much about them. Because for those who've gone through them, the experience is deeply personal. It lands differently for each person. It's almost impossible to communicate.
And that's the key distinction. What you will find online, the things that have leaked or been deliberately revealed, are details from so-called secret societies where the candidate is simply exposed to a ceremony. There's no preparation, no guided work beforehand in mind, body, and spirit. No progressive development leading toward a transformative moment. You just show up and the ritual happens to you.
And because those instant initiation rituals are more prescriptive, more one-size-fits-all, they're much easier to describe to someone who wasn't there. The experience is more uniform, so the words capture more of it. Genuine initiatory work is the opposite. When someone has spent months or years being prepared, when the ceremony arrives at exactly the right moment in their development, the experience resonates so deeply that words simply don't do it justice. The secret keeps itself.
Great question, Fatima. Okay, last question for today. Brief one from Ian in Galway, responding to the Lost Libraries episode. He asks, if so much wisdom was lost in the destruction of the great libraries, how can any tradition claim to preserve ancient knowledge? Isn't everything we have fragmentary at best?
Oh, that's honest.
Very honest. And yes, everything we have is fragmentary. There's no pretending otherwise. The destruction was catastrophic. We lost more than we kept. Maybe 90% of ancient literature is gone.
But here's the thing. What survived for a reason. The texts that made it through multiple centuries of copying and translation and war and fire were the ones that communities found most essential. The ones people risked their lives to preserve. Natural selection applied to wisdom literature.
And oral traditions preserved things that written traditions lost. Many indigenous knowledge systems carried teachings across thousands of years without ever writing them down. Different preservation technology. Equally valid. There were and are many people throughout the ages who dedicated themselves to ensuring the transmission of what survived wasn't corrupted from one generation to the next, like passing on the torch. And because of oppression, politics, wars, religion, and 1,000 other reasons, a lot of this went underground for centuries to keep it safe and unpolluted.
What we work with at Trikala is one of those threads whose core role is to preserve and continue that lineage of direct transmission through time. It's honest about its limitations. We don't claim to have everything the ancients knew. We claim to have studied what remains with the depth and seriousness it deserves. And frankly, what remains is more than enough for several lifetimes of transformative work.
Keep the questions coming. Podcast at MAAOoT.org.
Before we go, if you've been finding value in these conversations, Leaving a review on your podcast platform genuinely helps.
We have listeners who care. That's how people find us. A rating, a review, sharing an episode with someone who'd resonate with it. These small things add up.
I'll be honest, I'm still working with the Metanoia block myself, even after all these years.
We all are. That's the thing about genuine practice. You never fully arrive.
Exactly. So if you're sitting with your own resistance right now, if you're feeling that tug between wanting to change and wanting to stay safe, then feel free to check out our website. There are tons of articles and discussions on there about this very subject.
100% the web address is MAAOoT.org.
We're not teachers speaking down from some enlightened peak.
We're practitioners sharing the path.
And the Metanoia block, it doesn't go away. You just get better at recognizing it, more skilled at working with it rather than against it.
And that recognition, that skill, that's what this whole thing is about.
Ab immemorabili, from time beyond memory.
The resistance is real.
And so is the transformation on the other side of it.
Keep going.
Keep going.